Salvete omnes! Welcome to the big subjunctives video. This is a video for WriteLatin.org using the Lingua Latina per se illustrata curriculum textbook, but of course it could be used in any class, and so please feel free to download this PowerPoint in the description underneath this video so that you can use it in your class. First, go through the theory of the subjunctive, mainly in English. Then we're going to go through the four tenses of the Latin subjunctive, which I have different names for them than the standard names. And then we're going to hit the irregular verbs' subjunctive forms. And lastly, we're going to go through about the 7 or so different kinds of subjunctive clauses, ways that the subjunctive is used in real life. If you are using Lingua Latina per se illustrata or my website, you can just skip to those sections that are relevant to your particular chapter using this right column here. Before we start, we need to review what these symbols mean. This means the I form, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, they. The forward-looking head, it means forward-looking or prospective into the future. Backward-looking head is backward-looking or retrospective into the past. Also, the passive forms we know now. I am blanked, you are blanked, he, she, it is blanked, we are blanked, y'all are blanked, and they are blanked. Alrighty, so we first should probably briefly review how we get the present stem, like woka in this case. Remember, there's 2 possible rules you can use. The old standard rule is for the first 2 conjugations to take the second principal part minus re, and then for the remaining conjugations to take the first principal part minus o. But I told you that that is very confusing, and that a better rule to follow would just be to remember that these 5 conjugations follow the 5 rules: long A verbs, long E verbs, nothing verbs because the stem ends in nothing, short I verbs, and long I verbs. All right, so let's get into the big theory of subjunctives. What are our subjunctives? Well, up till now we have only learned about statements about certainty, what actually happened or what actually will happen in the future. But now we're going to incorporate the realm of possibility of hypothetical, theoretical things. So around this timeline of actual sequence of events, one after another, there's this cloud of possibilities. These are like parallel universes, parallel realities that may have happened potentially, maybe became real, or were just imaginary. So the word for this is hypothetical. These are hypotheticals, possibilities. Now, up till now, we used what's called the indicative mood for all the certain events, actual chain of events things. You didn't know it as the indicative mood, but that is the technical term for it. So all those tenses you learned up until now were the indicative mood. But now we're going to add on to that a new mood called the subjunctive mood. And this subjunctive mood is used for all these hypothetical possibilities and likelihoods. All right, so in English and Latin, there are 2 different situations based on whether the main verb in the sentence is past tense or present tense. So the first situation is that the main verb is either present or future tense, like I hope that you, or I will hope that you as our main verb. In Latin, this would be petebo ut, or petto ut. Now, if that's the case, then the subjunctive verb will be some form of shall, will, can, may. Either shall, will, can, may itself if it's forward-looking, or shall have, will have, can have, may have if it's backward-looking. We use the green forward-looking head for prospective to signify a forward-looking subjunctive, and the orange one to signify a backward-looking subjunctive. Notice how as the main verb shifts from future to present, the cloud of subjunctive possibilities shift with it. So wherever that main verb goes, any given subjunctive in its cloud is relative to its time. All right, so this is called the relative time rule, that the subjunctive is only secondary, and its exact time on the timeline can only be determined after you determine the time of the main verb, which is primary. So the main verb determines where in time the subjunctives verb can occur. Notice that as the main verb becomes closer and closer to the present, at times the shell of will of can of may have form here extends all the way back into the past. So even though this is a present or future tense main verb, the shell of action could have gone on back then. Now the second situation that can occur is when we have a past tense main verb. This could be any of the three past tenses that you know already. Perfect, like I hoped that you, pluperfect, like I had hoped that you, and imperfect, like I was hoping that you. And there's your Latin forms. If the main verb is any of these three, then the subjunctive will be should, would, could, might, or should have, would have, could have, might have, based on whether we want to talk about looking forward to a future possibility or backward to a past possibility of what might have happened. Again, here too, this also follows the relative time rule. So the time when the subjunctive occurred is relative to the time when the main verb occurred. Notice that even though that this is a past tense main verb, at times the green subjunctive of it extends all the way into the present or even future tense. You know, if the main verb is close enough to the present, then it could be talking about a should, would, could, or might that's going on now, or even in the future. All right, I'd like you to go through these questions. Here you'll see that I've divided the four tenses of the subjunctive. I only put this plus here to remind you that it also includes the future. So present subjunctive looking forward, present subjunctive looking back, past tense looking forward, past tense looking back. Hopefully you can easily fill in this chart based on what you just saw in the previous slides. You can also do these questions down here. In question 4 here, we have now covered all three of the three moods in Latin. Stop the video and attempt these, and then start it up when you're ready to go on. All right, we have also by now covered all 5 attributes of a verb, which are all the ways that a verb can change. And this is actually something that you should memorize. I want you to try to list from your mind as many of these possibilities as you possibly can. And there are clues over here that you can click on to help you if you are using the downloaded PowerPoint. So stop the video now and try to fill this in, and I will put up the answers shortly. Now that we have 4 tenses of the subjunctive, how do you decide which one you should use? What's the actual thought process to make that decision? Well, there are 2 different situations that we covered in previous slides, and notice that. In each of these situations, we could have to use a present stem or a perfect stem. Notice that. So there's no quick, easy solution to rule out certain possibilities. So what we're going to learn in future slides of this video is that if you want a present main verb opining about a hypothetical event somewhere in the future, you're going to change the stem sign letter of the verb to the opposite of what you might expect. So an A verb like vocare will get an E, or an E verb will get an A. So it's just the opposite of what you might expect. Notice that in green here we're using the present stem. In the perfect tense, if we're backward looking and talking about a reality in the past, then we're going to use the perfect stem here in orange. And notice this one should look very familiar to you if you've learned the future perfect already, but if you haven't, then you'll get that in chapter 30. We're going to take the perfect stem and add on a form of the future tense of sum. And I made it blue here so that you would remember, oh yeah, it's future, the future tense. And the way these two combine is that the perfect stem in orange gives us the have blanked, in other words, the VE and ED, and the future tense in blue gives us the may. If you've got a past tense main verb opining about some event in the future, then we're going to use the infinitive, second principal part, plus an ending. It's really simple. And if we've got a past tense main verb talking about some event way back in the past, then we're going to use perfect stem plus an adulteration or mess up of the form of to be, esse, plus our ending. So here's what they all look like. Notice also that vocare, with its present infinitive, can talk about an event in the present, because that blue arrow extends so far into the future that it even gets into the present and future, that it can even talk about a hypothetical event occurring contemporaneously right now or even in the future. So here they all are, and you can see that they're pretty well symmetric. Each situation has two arrows coming into it. Okay, so let's talk a moment about what you should hear in your ear and then think when you hear each of these subjunctive words. If you hear something that sounds like an infinitive, like vocawisse or vocare, that signifies abstract reality. Abstract is something that is otherworldly, theoretical, divorced from reality, has no flesh and bones on it, but is just like an idea. That's abstract. The infinitive is an abstract action treated as a noun. You're concretizing it and viewing it as a noun abstractly, like calling itself, the act of calling itself. And so it's natural when we hear an infinitive in our ear that we should naturally think, oh, should, would, could, might, because should, would, could, might is also an abstract theoretical reality. So infinitives like the action of calling or the state of having called naturally are conducive to this idea of shouldness, wouldness, couldness, or mightness. However, if we hear some form of future, like this E or A, which is very similar to your third and fourth conjugation A and E rule, if you forgot that, like decom, decase, decet, or this erim, which is similar to ero, eris, erit, the form of the verb to be in its future tense, then that is not abstract. That more suggests possibility and freedom and potentiality. Why does it do this? Well, the reason it does it is because in vocem, by changing that vowel to its opposite of what you would expect, it gives this idea of freedom that, hey, I can break the rules, or I'm being different and unique. And that difference and unique should make you realize that, oh, this is a subjunctive verb, a possibility, a hypothetical thing that might happen, not something that it certainly will happen. The vocabulary doesn't signify freedom quite as much. That's just because this tense is so close to the future perfect that it really kind of gets swallowed up and absorbed by the future perfect and is hardly even a subjunctive tense at all. So what is the chain of thought that you should follow as you're deciding which of these four subjunctive tenses to make when you want to write a sentence? Well, remember the first decision is up here in the top row. Is my main verb a present or be later than that tense, or is my main verb a past tense? So based on that, you'll either go to the left with past tense or to the right with present or future. After that, once you've noticed what your main verb is, then you'll pick from one of the two possibilities. On the right here, if you've got a present main verb, then it will be vocaburim or vocem, depending if you want to be looking to the future or to the past. Over here on the left, you'll pick from one of these two verbs, vocarim or vocawism. And you can see that you can use any of the four subjunctive words, whichever one you please. Should, would, might, could, it doesn't matter. This brings in the second and easier way to think about it. You think to yourself, okay, does it feel past-ish or does it feel present future-ish? Once you decide that, then you say ut, which means so that. And then you just have to know by experience what two subjunctives go with the past main verb and which one of them is the apostrophe VE one, and which two subjunctives go with the present future-ish main verb and which one is the apostrophe VE one. Obviously, the perfect stem ones are the apostrophe VE ones, but you have to actually just know them and be able to rattle them off. And you can think about it in English like this. I blanked so that I might blank or might have blanked. and then in the right side, I blank so that I may blank or may have blanked. All right, try to answer these questions. As you answer these, pay particular attention to what tense the main verb is in, because that will tell you which of the two situations you're in. All right, so stop the video and then you can start it to see the answers. All right, there they are. And then attempt these as well, which are very similar. Notice too that nay down here is just the negative form of ut. So if ut is so that, nay then would be so that not. Or our English way of saying that is lest. All right, so now you have a good grasp of the concept of the subjunctive. Now we just need to get really good at writing these subjunctives, and that's what we're going to do in this next part of the video. All right, so here we're in the second of the 3 parts of the subjunctives video, and right now we're going to learn how to make all 4 of the subjunctive tenses. And so our first tense is going to be the present looking forward or prospective subjunctive tense. The old name for this was the present subjunctive, but I use different names because I think it's more descriptive the way I call them and more appropriate to what they're actually doing. So the way you do this is you take the present stem and you make a vowel change. I took away the A on the first one, but everything else is at stem. And now I'm going to put on E or A, which is also the opposite of the proper vowel for each of these conjugations, because first conjugation should be A vowels, but now it's E, and the rest should not be A vowels, but now they are. So that's the way that works. And then onto that we put our endings. Very simple, nothing special to it. And the translation is shall, will, can, or may. So they shall call, or may call, they may laugh, they may do, and they may hear. Notice the pattern that is made by these vowels. So this is a good way for you to remember what vowel each conjugation gets. There are 2 ways you can memorize it. You can go with the pink letters here or with the green and pink. So just the pink letters is, remember, first conjugation becomes an E, and all the extras get an extra A. The other way you can remember it is remember the saying, Ben read a diary, and that will let you know what the vowels should ultimately end up as. Because the green ones here, of course, are part of the stem, whereas the red ones aren't. So that is an ambiguity, and you can pick whichever system suits you best. Just a reminder here, third IO conjugation is actually treated as if it were fourth conjugation. So facet becomes faciat, like down in the last row, and not facat, like in the third row. As for the irregular verbs, the verb to be, sumus est sunt, becomes a flimsy simicit, shall be, I may be, you may be, she may be. And the irregular verb to go, eo is it, imus itis eunt, becomes eam, eas, eat, eamus, eatis, eant. The E here is the same as in eo and eunt. So notice the last one, eunt, becomes eant, and that's the closest change that you can see there. So I may go, you may go, she may go, and so on. As for the passives, you just add on the aristur, murmini, inter endings. Volcare, I am called. Volcaris, you are called. Volcator, he is called. Volcamur, we are called. Volcamini, y'all are called. And volcentur, they are called. And the meanings for that are the standard passive meanings, involving a be blanked in the meaning. All right, so let's compare these now. I want to compare this new tense, the present forward-looking subjunctive, to the future, so that you make the connection in your mind where these two are similar and where they're not. So we're going to go conjugation by conjugation. First conjugation has no similarities. The future with bi is very different from the present forward-looking subjunctive. Second conjugation, also no similarities. But now look at the third conjugation. It's identical in 5 out of the 6 forms. So unless there was some sort of pitch change in the way these two were said, there is no discernible difference between you will do and you may do, which lets you know that this present forward-looking subjunctive is really a kind of future in a way, because may implies something that may happen in the future, of course. Now, as for third IO and fourth conjugation, notice that they are identical in only one of the 6 forms. Everywhere else, there is a distinction between you will hear and you shall hear or may hear. All right, try these questions. You want to change the indicative verb to a subjunctive, and I included the conjugation in there, so like no case you know is a long E verb. Also change the translation when you change it into subjunctive. So he drinks should become he may drink, bibat. And if you forgot how to do these, then rewind the video and see how to change each and every conjugation. So do these 9 and then do the next 9 on the next slide and then restart the video and I will put up the answers. Okay, so that was one tense. Now we're on to our second tense. This is the past forward looking. And so this is the green area that you saw earlier in the show. And you can see this one has the infinitive as part of its stem, wokarem. And so we need that infinitive is going to imply abstractness. This is going to connote an abstract or a virtual reality, not something real, not something actual, but just abstract in theory. And that's going to give us our English translation, should. It should, or it might, or it would happen. If it would happen, is it really happening? No, no. So that's the sense of this tense. So what is abstractness? Well, see this cube over here? That's a real thing, but our mind has the ability to abstract away from various aspects of it until it gets barer and barer and starker until you are just left with nothing but the intellectual definition or concept. So that power of abstraction which you have in your mind is what enables us to have this subjunctive tense, talking about what hypothetically should or might or would happen. So, how do you make this? Well, the infinitive, the present infinitive, means to blank. And that is a concretization or abstraction of a verbal action into a noun. So wokare is actually a noun. It doesn't look like a noun. It doesn't look like a person, place, or thing. You can't point to it anywhere, but it is grammatically a noun. And you will learn that later on when you learn the gerund, that this infinitive can actually decline, and it becomes wokandi, wokando, wokandum, wokando. That's not this lesson here. But in any case, this is the idea of calling itself. And onto this idea, we're going to tack the endings to let us know who is doing this abstract, virtual, in principle, not real, but hypothetically imaginary calling. So the way you do it is you put the ending on just like that. And this is going to mean doing the being, as it were, of running. That's what the sense of it is. When you say kurret, you're saying he is doing the kurret, the as it were existence of running. And again, this is an abstract event. It's not like it's really happening somewhere, except in your imaginary mind. So the standard translation for that then is he might run in this imaginary abstract reality. And notice that I use a special color here, which is a little more faded, so you realize that it's not the full, real green, but it's the abstract, less real, more potential, not actual kind of an event. So just take your infinitive then and stick on your endings. I would call, you would call, she would call, we would call, y'all would call, and they would call. And the translations are simple. Should, would, could, or might, any of them. And then for the passives, it's just the same again. You just stick on the passive endings. I might be called, you might be called, she might be called, we might be called, y'all might be called, and they might be called. So in this case, you're not doing the calling, but someone else is doing it. All right, try these questions. You're supposed to take the underlined words and make a past forward-looking subjunctive out of them. Of course, I will first give you the conjunction, which is usually ut or ne or something like that. All right, so stop the video and attempt these 6, and then start it up again, and I will put up the answers. The third subjunctive tense is the present past-looking or retrospective subjunctive. So this is going to be when you have a present or future main verb, but it is talking about something that happened previously to that. And it could be any time previously. Remember, the role of relative time means that if the main verb is present, then it will have to be in the past. But if the main verb is future, then that subjunctive verb could be still slightly in the future and not yet into the past. Or it could be even right now. So this is going to be a really boring, hardly ever used tense. It is practically identical to another tense that you will learn in stage 30. So if you learn it right now, then guess what? You don't have to learn anything really in stage 30, because this tense is the same as that tense in stage 30, except this one is just more broad and general. So if you learn the general situation here, you'll have no problem applying it to the specific case up then in the future, several chapters from now. Okay, so let's take a look at the similarities between this new subjunctive on the right and that future perfect that we're going to learn in stage 30 on the left. They're identical practically. The only difference is ero becomes erim in the subjunctive, in the more general subjunctive. Okay, everything else is the same. So, and the way you translate these are I will have called, whereas this one is I will have called, or I shall, can, or may have called as well. So this has 4 possible will, shall, can, may, and this one only has 1 possible word, will. So what's the difference? There really isn't one. All right, so how did this present backward-looking subjunctive occur? Well, it really was the future perfect to begin with. And what happens is that the future perfect occurs in a very limited situation with the future. If you will have blanked, then something will blank. And if that is broken in any way, like the main verb suddenly no longer becomes future, but instead becomes present, then what's going to happen is that the other verb, the future perfect, suddenly just now becomes called the present backward-looking subjunctive, or the term that most people like, they call it the perfect subjunctive, which I think is so badly described, because perfect is the word for the past, and this is really something having to do with looking forward to the future. So I don't like the name perfect, because it just conveys looking in the wrong direction. Okay, but that's why I changed the name of this tense to the present backward-looking subjunctive. Remember also this tense here is to remind you that it's not just present. It could be also a future main verb. So really I could call it the present or future backward-looking subjunctive, but I didn't want to say all that. So I just say the present plus to distinguish it from past subjunctives. So if the main verb stays future or at least present, then the new subjunctive will have nearly the same identical Latin spelling as we saw on the previous slide, but it will now be called the present backward-looking, or by the old system, perfect subjunctive, rather than the future perfect indicative. All right, blah, blah, blah. I can see that they may have caulked the boat by now. May have, as opposed to what it used to be, if you will have caulked the boat, then we will sail. Now I can see that they may have caulked the boat by now. Therefore, let's take a chance and sail. All right.
Alrighty. So, the form of this is Wokawarim, I may have called, you may have called, she may have called, we may have called, y'all may have called, they may have called. Now, that was easy. This is hard. Harder. Okay, so the passives then are not going to be nearly so easy as they were in the previous two subjunctive tenses that you just learned. Okay, so we need to take as our model the future perfect. And however that makes its passive is probably how we're going to make our passive of the present backward-looking subjunctive. So, wokawaro was one of the perfect stem tenses, as you see the three of them here. And the way these all make their passive is when they're active, they take the third principal part, minus the I. But if they're passive, then they take the, instead, fourth principal part. So the way you'd make passive then of all of these is not wokav, the perfect stem, but wokatus ero. So here's the passives of each of these tenses. Called I will be, called I am, called I was being, or more colloquially, I will have been called, I was called, I had been called. However, notice that these are two separate words. This term here, the fourth principal part, is called a participle. It is an adjective, called. I am called. But it has, as you can hear, it has verbal content inside of it. And that idea of an adjective with verbal content inside of it is what a participle is. And so this wokatus is what we're going to use to make the passive of wokawarim, just like in chapter 30 we make the passive of wokawaro. Okay, so wokawaro and wokatus ero are future perfect, but to make it present backward-looking subjunctive, we're going to just change that O to im. Now, it's not perfect because you would have thought that this would be wokatus erim, but instead it's going to become sim, which is the flimsy subjunctive form of sum here, which I blotted out so that you wouldn't think of sim and sum as being different tenses on the timeline. Really, sum is present and sim is potentially present, because a subjunctive is just a hazy cloud that could be anywhere, present or future or past, depending on when his main verb is. So sim is just the subjunctive form of sum. And you're going to have to get used to sticking on the sim instead of what you would have expected, erim. Okay, so although the future perfect and present subjunctive are nearly identical in their active voice, as we saw on the previous slide, yet in their passive voice, they have a different form of the verb to be. The future perfect has ero, I will be, but the subjunctive uses sim, I may be, the flimsy sim. So this is the way you'll make each of these tenses. Stop the video, take a good hard look at it, and get familiar with these forms. Now notice it's flipping here between singular and plural. And of course blue is masculine, pink is feminine, and gray is neuter. And you can put any one of these endings with any one of those. So a girl would say wokata sim, for instance. I may have been called. And several girls would say wokatai simus, we may have been called. So will have been called and may have been called. And we're more interested in the one on the left. So get used to it. You're going to have to make these. Alright, so the future perfect, let's just go with the model first. In its active becomes wokav plus ero. In its passive it becomes wokatus plus ero, even though they are now in two separate words. Wokatus ero, wokatus eris, wokatus erit, wokatierimus, wokatieritis, and wokatierint. And let's include the other two genders just so we are not discriminatory. And the translation of that's going to be will have been blanked, occurring sometime before the future. Whereas this here is the present backward-looking subjunctive. And this too is going to take wokawarim, but then when it goes into passive, it's going to become sim instead. So, vocatus sim, I may have been called. Vocatus sis, you may have been called. Vocatus sit, he may have been called. Vocatissimus, vocatisitis, and vocatisint, they may have been called. And did you notice, I hope, that the stem changed halfway through all that when we switched into plural? I hope you did. And these are the other two genders, just to be non-discriminatory, and the translation is may have been called. More general and amorphous and fuzzy. All right, so stop the video and attempt these questions. Also check and see if there's more questions on the next slide. Okay, so I hope you got all these questions right. Notice in number 4 that deponent is a passive form but an active meaning. So even though it has an active meaning, have promised, yet we use a passive looking form, pollicatus sim. Of course, you already knew this about deponents. It's nothing new, but I just wanted to point that out. Hopefully you were able to do all those exercises, and now we are on to our 4th subjunctive tense, the past backward looking, or the old traditional name for it was the pluperfect subjunctive, which I think is really misleading. So, in any case, the way you make this one is you use the perfect infinitive to have blanked, vocawisse, and you add on an ending. Okay, so what is that perfect infinitive? In case you forgot, you take the third principle, you take the perfect stem, vocav, and add on an adulterated form of esse, which became isse. But it really is esse, but it just is said like isse. And that means to be in a state of having called, having blanked. So, to have called, to have laughed, to have run, and to have heard. All right, and onto this, we add our ending. What then do the parts of this really mean when you hear them? What should you think? Well, the T means doing. He is doing it, she is doing it. The esse means doing the being of something. And then the kukuri means not now, but back then. So put it all together and you get doing, being as it were, in a reported state or in a historical state. And this esse here is an infinitive, which conveys an idea of abstractness. And hopefully you know by now that abstractness is when you take something and tear away from it with your mind down to its base, essential, bare structure or definition. That's abstracting. And so we can do that and come up with a concept. And that's basically what you're doing with these past backward looking subjunctive. You're taking an action and stripping it down to just the concept of doing that action. He was just doing the concept of it. So that's where we're going to get our translation, should have. He should, in this imaginary reported state, have run. He should have run. And notice again that I took this esse and put it in an off-color faded orange to remind you that this action is not real like solid orange over here, but abstract. I might have laughed, you might have laughed, he might have laughed, we might have laughed, y'all might have laughed, they might have laughed. Okay. Once again, then, the hard part will be the passives, but this one will be easier because we don't have a weird sim to deal with on this one. This one will follow exactly what you would expect it to do. All right, so just a brief review again. These perfect stem endings make their active using the third principal part, vocav, whereas in their passive they use the fourth, and that appears like this in the passive. You know, it's a separate word, so that's why I use a balloon, because there's a separation there between the vocatus and the arrow. It's not like the vocatus is leaning against arrow in the very same word. So vocatus arrow. So that's how you make the passives up there. And then we're going to do the exact same thing to make our past backward-looking subjunctive. So for this one, I'm going to compare the past backward-looking subjunctive to the pluperfect. So vocawaram and vocawissem are not very similar. pluperfect uses eram with the participle, whereas this new subjunctive that we're learning today is going to use esem plus the participle. Now, what is esem? Do you remember? Hopefully you remember back from slide 40 that this green color is the present infinitive, to be, plus an ending. So esse is just your infinitive of sum. So it goes sum esse fui. And that combines with the participle like this. Notice also that we only have nominative endings here because the doer of the verb is always a nominative. It is never dative or accusative or anything like that. All right, so I had been called, it's pluperfect, but I would have, might have, should have, or could have been called would be past backward-looking subjunctive. All right, and you could have hopefully guessed that if you had been following the pattern of may have, might, now it's might have. So you could hopefully follow the pattern of all our 4 subjunctive tenses that they went will have, would, what comes next? Would have. All right, so we're obviously focused on this tense here. And the pluperfect therefore went vocaveram vocatus eram in its passives, making it I had been called, you had been called, she had been called, we had been called, y'all had been called, they had been called, whereas the past backward looking subjunctive is going to tack on esem. Ism is a form of it, making it be vocatus esem, vocatus esses, vocatus esset, vocati essemus, vocati essetis, vocati essent. They might have been called. Okay, let's ham it up. And hopefully you noticed that changed halfway through when we switched into plurals. And to include the other genders, you could have those too, but they're always nominative, never dative, accusative, or ablative, or genitive. And that gives us the translation should have been called. All right, so stop the video and attempt these questions. Hopefully you're in the habit of doing these and can predict what their answers will be by now. And then also do the next slide. And notice on the first question on the next slide, there are actually 2 past backward looking subjunctives that you have to do, not just 1. Okay, so stop the video and start it when you're ready to see the answers. On this one, notice fuiscent. That is your verb of to be in this past backward-looking subjunctive. So get in the habit of recognizing that, because that is an easy thing to take note of. Same with esem. That is the past forward-looking form of it. So get in the habit of noticing them. All right, so bringing it all together. So we have our 4 subjunctive tenses. We've got active on the top and passive on the bottom. And so the actives, again, were Ben read a diary, and wokav erim, and then wokarim, and wokawisim, and then down in the passives it will be blanked of whatever was in the active. So may have called becomes may have been called. Would call becomes would be called, and would have called becomes would have been called. And the ways you make these are in the present forward looking, you just tack on the aristur murmini inter endings. Same over here in the third one, the past forward looking, just aristur murmini inter endings. But to make the passive of the other 2, you need, since it's a perfect stem tense, you need to use the participle to make the passive. And so one will get sim, and the other will get esem. So sim was the subjunctive of sum, maybe, and the other gets esem, might be. You might think of sim as a subjunctive of sum, and it is, but it's bigger than that. So, because it could also include future. It's kind of the subjunctive also of ero. Same with SM. You might think of it as the subjunctive of eram, and most teachers will tell you that. They will say, oh, this is the imperfect subjunctive, and so it is the subjunctive of the imperfect indicative, which was eram. But the answer you should say to them is, well, it's bigger than that, because SM is a subjunctive not just of eram, but also of phooey. So when they say that to you, shout, phooey, phooey. That's just phooey in the subjunctive, not just eram. Okay, so haha, funny, funny. And then they'll say back to you, oh no, but phooey is perfect, and the perfect subjunctive of phooey is phooerim. And then you should say back to them, oh, but phooey meant something happening in the past, whereas phooerim could mean something happening in the present or future. So how are those two the same? Or phooey is translated have blanked, whereas phooerim is translated will have blanked. So how are will or shall or may futurishly have blanked? So how are those two the same? That's just if you want to do your little part to change the old way of doing things to a new, more proper way of thinking about these. There really is no comparison between the 4 subjunctive tenses and the 6 indicative tenses. The 6 indicative tenses are rigid, are at certain points on the timeline, and the 4 subjunctive tenses are at certain other points on the timeline, and they move, whereas the 6 indicatives don't really move. Okay. Alrighty. So bringing it all together, hopefully this slide should make a lot more sense to you now. May call, may have called, might call, or would call, would have called. Put them all together and they look like a mess, but we can organize them a little more nicely. Notice that each one has a come in and then a go out, and a come in and a go out. And then in the passives, may be called, may have been called, might be called or would be called, and then would have been called. Put them together and they make a mess, but they can be organized. And notice that the orange spheres have orange stems, and the green spheres have green stems. So get these things straight in your mind. You might have to stop the video and to really get your full phantasm view of this so that you can remember it. All right, and then the last thing in this part of the video is irregular verbs. The verb to be and the verb to go. And these do not have a passive, because you can't say I was beed or I was goned. No, no, no. So they only have active. And we have the principal parts of go down at the bottom here now. In our 4 tenses, these are going to follow the expected patterns except in the present forward-looking subjunctive. So there, sum becomes sim, and eo, is, it, imos, itis, eunt becomes eam, eas, eat, eamus, eatus, eant. We shall go. And these two are irregular, just in this subjunctive tense only. The others follow the rules. Perfect stem plus form of erim. Present infinitive plus ending. Perfect infinitive plus ending. And the translations are exactly what you would expect. So, tense review. Where in the timeline do each of these occur? Hopefully you can do these now. If you don't want me to tell you, then press M on your keyboard to mute it so you don't hear what I say. But the way it is present backward looking, present forward looking, past forward looking, present forward looking, present forward looking, past forward looking, present backward looking, past forward-looking, present backward-looking, present forward-looking. Oh yes, and this is a form of the verb to want. Wolo, I want, becomes wellim, I may, well, shall, can want. It's a nicer way to say it than just to say, I want it. Wellem is I would want, I might want. It's a nicer way to say it. Would've is past backward looking, present backward looking, past backward looking, past backward looking. Potfuisem, past backward looking, I might have been able. Past backward looking, I might have wanted. Present backward looking, I may have gone. Present forward looking, past forward looking, and that's them all. So see if you can do it now without colors. Good luck. Stop the video and start it again when you want to see the answers. All right, so now you know all the forms of the subjunctive tenses. All that is left is to figure out how to use them in sentences, and that's going to be the third and final portion of this subjunctives video.
This is the third and final part of the subjunctives video, and in this we're going to bring it all together and figure out exactly how to use subjunctives in sentences. And there are about 7 or 8 different kinds of subjunctive clauses, which will take a subjunctive, and we are going to learn them now. The ones above the line here are all forward-looking or prospective, so almost all the verbs are present stem subjunctives. They are the result clause, the purpose clause, and the indirect command. They almost all use uti, so that, or ne, so that not, or lest. The one distinguishing factor is the result clause often has this adverb tam, so, or some form of it like tantus talus, tantopere, totienes, and etc. It may also have itas, which means so. Next is the hortatory or Jussive subjunctive. This one is unique and strange and fun because it's so easy. It doesn't need a main verb, and it doesn't even need a conjunction like ut. It can just be by itself. So it's let blank happen or may blank happen is the hortatory or Jussive subjunctive. The ones down here now below the line have both kinds of subjunctives in them, so they're much more complex and difficult. First we're going to learn the CUM clause, which of course always uses cum as its adverb, almost always. Then the conditional sentence, which uses if or if not, nisi, which can also be translated unless or except, because that's the same as if not. And actually both of these can have a second subjunctive where the main verb would be. So you could have all subjunctives through the sentence. Num is kind of like if. Num ... on means whether or, but it's not usually used in conditional sentences so much. That's used more in the next big kind of clause, which is indirect questions. Now, indirect questions usually use any of your 6 famous interrogatives: who, what, where, when, why, how, or any form of those, like where from or where to, or feminine, for instance, or whose, or to whom, dative. So any of these, indirect question. I'm going to skip relative clause of characteristic just because it's so rare that you can look it up yourself in a grammar somewhere if you really care, but it's pretty rare. It's just like, such a person as would do blank. That's what the relative clause of characteristic is. And it too is introduced by these qui, quae, quod relative pronouns. So first let's go through the 3 simple subjunctives that were above the line, which are only forward-looking. So they all use uti or ne, so that not, and they all use subjunctives that are forward-looking with a present stem, not a perfect stem. Result clause, symbolized by this ricocheting ball, and the distinguishing factor is a form of tam, usually. So great he was that he would break a bridge. Now, hopefully, you will never say something this cruel to someone. That's really not nice to say, but it demonstrates what a result clause is. That something is so much that, in theory, it would result in some way. Tantus is the same. Tantus erat, so great he was that he would break a bridge. Or talus, such he was as would break a bridge, and so on. And then, of course, in the present or future main verbs, it becomes a present-looking, forward-looking subjunctive instead of a past. So, as may break a bridge. So great he is as he may break a bridge, that he will break a bridge, things like that. Ita can also substitute for Tom, although I don't see ita very commonly. It's almost always Tom. Okay, so next up is the purpose clause in the middle, in the pink. This is anytime someone wants and wills to do one thing for another. I'm doing X so that Y. That's a purpose clause. It's intentional, unlike the result clause, which is accidental, unintended. Purpose clause, you intended it. So, they worked so that they might repair the bridge. I hope that I may live. I take care lest I may die. Things like this. These are all purpose clauses. Lastly, indirect commands are pretty simple. You should be able to figure these out by now. I command that you may obey. I commanded that you might obey, based on whether the main verb is present or past. All right, so let's try some of these. So great he was. Now, the first thing you look at is where is the main verb? Is it present or is it past? And this one is obviously past, so the subjunctive clause is going to be relative to that, in this case in the green area. So great he was that he would break a bridge. Could break a bridge. Such great he was. So much great he was. So great he was, and so on. Now, if it's a present main verb, then it's going to become can break a bridge. And, of course, you know all the M, S, H, and W alternatives can be used as well. So the idea of the result clause is this tantus is so much that it causes a result out here in the subjunctive clause. All right, next one, purpose clauses. You look first at your main verb. Is it present or past? This one is past. And so the subjunctive clause is going to be relative to that past point. So they worked that they might repair the bridge. They work that they may repair the bridge. We switched into a present subjunctive. Can repair the bridge, shall repair the bridge, will repair the bridge. Uh-oh, what happened here? They work so that they may not repair the bridge, will not. Or the more colloquial and easy way to say it is lest. They work lest they shall repair the bridge. They're maybe putting up all obstacles so that the foreman cannot tell them to get to work. Okay. All right, that's a purpose clause. Almost always uses ut or nay. Lastly is the indirect command. We look at our main verb, and this one is not past. This time it's present. So the subjunctive clause will be relative to that present or future, but in this case present, point in time. So I command lest you may speak. In English we just say I command you not to speak, but we want to include that subjunctive sense in it. So I would like you to say may or shall or can or will. Lest you may speak, that you may not speak. And I commanded lest you might speak, lest you could speak, would speak, should speak. I commanded that you should speak. Okay, that's an indirect command. So how do you recognize these indirect commands? Well, obviously, the main verb is going to have to do something with commanding. And it's not just commanding, though. Commanding is most likely, like all these that you know already, but it could be requesting, because that's kind of commanding. Or begging, I beg, but because that is in a way commanding, though its pressure is much less. And even just something generic like saying could be an indirect command. I say that you shall do this. That would be an indirect command. I write that you should do this. That's also an indirect command. Even punishing and forbidding. I warn you lest you should do this. Indirect command. I prohibit lest you should do this. That's also an indirect command. All right, so hopefully you have a sense now of the kinds of main verbs that can introduce an indirect command. Okay, so our next subjunctive is the hortatory subjunctive. And this is the easy one, which does not need either a main verb or even a conjunction like ut. So it can just be colat. That's a sentence right there. Let him cultivate it. Prosit ei, may it profit him. May he cultivate, may he sow, may he reap, or let it profit him, let him cultivate, let him sow, let him reap. Now, if you want to be nice, you could include an ut prosit ei, that it may profit him. Or, if you want to be really cool, you could use an utinam. Oh, that it may profit him. Oh, that he may reap. So this is ways to ham it up. Notice in all of these, there is no main verb anywhere. It is a hortatory subjunctive verb, can stand by itself as a sentence, and it doesn't even need the ut. So anytime you see a subjunctive just standing by its lonesome self out in the middle of nowhere, then it's probably a hortatory subjunctive. Now, do you know where the word hortatory means? Remember this verb hortor, hortari, hortatasum from earlier on in your vocab? Yeah, that means to urge. So this is the subjunctive that is urging you. Alrighty, so let's categorize all these 4 kinds of subjunctives that we've learned so far. I want you to tell me what kind of subjunctive it is using those tip-off signs. So remember they were like a form of tam for result clause, or for indirect command, one of your verbs of commanding or begging or saying or punishing, things like that. Or if it's neither of those, then it's probably a purpose clause, especially if it demonstrates some sort of willpower of what someone is scheming and intending and purposing to do. That's probably a purpose clause. So stop the video and go question by question and try to decide in advance what kind of clause each of these are. There are 2 slides here, so after you finish this slide, then go on and do the next slide as well. And you also see a reason occur on the far right here telling why it is that particular kind of clause. Okay, so for this next clause, I want to go through a little demonstration here so that you will get the hang of what the difference is between a direct question and an indirect question. Okay, so this is a direct question, like, ubi sumus, where are we? Now you can make it an indirect question by having someone report that question. I don't know where we may be. And you see we have made it into a subjunctive by changing the sumus to its subjunctive form, simus, more flimsy. So that's the way that indirect questions are in Latin. You have to put the reported question into the subjunctive. I don't know where we may be. Ubi sumus? Nescio ubi simus. Then you can even make that into an indirect question, because I don't know where we are could become, why don't you know where we are? Cur nescis ubi simus. And that direct question, let's make that into an indirect question. Now, how are we going to do that? Which word are we going to make subjunctive to make this, why don't you know where we are, into an indirect question? Obviously, the overriding verb. We're going to make that subjunctive. I don't know why I may not know where we may be. I just don't got a clue. Okay. So you can see here that we have an indirect question, ubi simus, inside of another indirect question, cur nesciam, why may I not know? So, of course, that indirect question is being reported by the nescio. So anytime you have a main verb reporting something, and the thing reported is a question, that's going to go into the subjunctive, and it's going to be called an indirect question. Alrighty, so that's what we have in this. Of course, notice up top here the conjunctions, which will introduce an indirect question. Who, where, when, why, how, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so where are we? Main verb is present, ubi sumus. Now to make it into an indirect question, what do we need to do? We need to report it, so we need to bump another verb up in front of it. I don't know. Now the not knowing is being bumped up in front of it. Nescio ubi simus. See how that works? Direct question, indirect question. I don't know from where we may have come. Unde venerimus. I don't know where to we may go. Quo eamus. All these are subjunctives. But notice one of them is a backward-looking one. So a reported indirect question can be about something at any point in time. Now what if we made it past tense? I didn't know. Well, we'd have to make our main verb nescio into a past tense, wouldn't we? Nesciebam. And now let's do all these three questions again, this time with a past tense main verb. First one, maybe becomes might be. Ubi essemus. From where we may have come becomes might have come. Unde venissemus. And where to we may go becomes might go. Quo iremus. So now you've got all four of your kinds of subjunctives demonstrated here. Present forward-looking, present backward-looking, past forward-looking, and past backward-looking. So indirect question is very versatile. All these are indirect questions. So turn the following direct questions, in the parentheses, into indirect questions. I was not knowing why we would win. Make the we would win into a subjunctive so that this will be an indirect question. And I gave you over here on the right the verb that you will use. So how do you do this? Well, remember you always start with the main verb because the subjunctive's time will be relative to that. And now is this main verb past or is it present plus? Obviously it's past with the ba. So you immediately know that winko is going to be one of the two past subjunctives. And the dead giveaway here is would. Would is forward-looking, whereas would have would be backward-looking. So the way you make your past forward-looking subjunctive, remember, is second principal part plus an ending. Winkeremus. All right, so stop the video and attempt all these on this slide, and then start it again when you're ready to move on. All right, so our next clause is a CUM clause. And these things are powerful, and I think they're pretty fun as well. So now a CUM conjunction can have all these meanings that you see below here. A CUM temporal clause is where the CUM has the sense of when or while or after. A CUM causal clause is when the CUM has a sense of since or because. And a CUM concessive clause is when the CUM has a sense of although. So all of this from this tiny little word CUM. Where did the CUM come from? So the word for this is implicit. All these meanings here are implicit or could be implicit in the CUM. Now where did CUM come from? Well, CUM is just a Q form of TUM. Remember how you had quam tam, like as is blank, so is blank, and quantus tantus and all those? Well, here cum used to be QUM, then TUM. And now you know that TUM means then. So cum means, in some sense, now. And that's the basic meaning. But the problem is that this is subjunctive, so it's relative to the time of the main verb. So it doesn't always actually mean now. It really means when at that point in time, whenever the main verb was. So this is the most essential meaning of cum that I want you to learn. Whereas at that time, and or given that at that time. Now, why do I say whereas? Because whereas is the best English word that encompasses both since and although. You can say, since I won the race, I was happy. Although I lost the race, I was happy. Both of those can be replaced by whereas easily. Whereas I won the race, I was happy. Whereas I lost the race, I was not happy. So see how whereas does double duty. So that's why you need to remember whereas as one of the two most basic meanings of cum. The other most basic meaning is when, because when will cover for all of these. So after we would have eaten, the ceiling fell in on us, could become when we would have eaten, the ceiling fell in on us, and it still kind of works. So cum can mean any of these things. So when and whereas, therefore, are the two main literal meanings of cum. I want you to memorize both of these. And a slightly longer way to say that, which will make your sentences flow much more easily, to make you instantly understand their sense, is to put them together. Say to yourself, whereas at that time. If you say whereas at that time at every single cum, then you will get it, I guarantee it. You will understand the inner meaning of the CUM clause, no matter which one of these 5 figurative meanings it may have. Whereas at that time I lost the race, I was sad. You'll understand that that was although. Okay, so whereas and at that time are your literal senses. When, while, after, since, and although are your contextual senses or figurative senses of cum. So better is to memorize the literal, but if you need to translate and make it fancy for someone, then you're going to want to use one out of these 5 contextual meanings here, because it just sounds bad to be saying, whereas at that time, blah, blah, blah. But you will understand all the meanings of cum if you remember whereas at that time. Now, I also gave 2 other alternatives to whereas. What are they? Well, whereas is when cum is at the start of the sentence, when the cum clause comes first. Cum, yada, 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 blah, 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 like that. The other 2 are when cum comes in the middle of the sentence. Blah, 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 cum, yada, yada, yada. So in this case, you'd say blah, 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 given that at that time, yada, yada, yada. Or blah, 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 considering that at that time, yada, yada, yada. So cum and its cum clause can be in either half of the sentence. And depending where it is, it'll be smoother for you if you use the correct version of whereas. So depending where the main verb is, the cum clause can mean whereas at this time or whereas at that time. That's just a minor alteration. If you didn't even remember this, it wouldn't matter. Who cares? Okay, and then if it's in the middle of the sentence, we'd have given at this time, given at that time. So I'd like you to try these now. Decide which of the 3 literal senses of cum would be appropriate. This is only 3 questions, so you're only getting your feet wet. Let's do it together. Nihil temere debebamos. We were owing it to fear nothing. Cum ferox leo catenis vinctus esset. Now, cum is in the middle of the sentence, so let's say, given that at that time, and at that time, since it was past, the fierce lion with chains might have been bound. See how that works? We should not have feared, given that at that time, the fierce lion with chains might have been bound. So we're going to pick B here, given that. Next one. Nuper fabrum cum urbis clavibus herri vidi, quamquam lex tale non desinit. All right, so recently, a craftsman with the city's keys yesterday I saw, although the law such does not permit. All right, so what usage of cum would this be? Well, obviously it's cum claudibus, cum plus the ablative. So this isn't even a cum clause at all. Okay, joy, joy. That's going to be your standard meaning of cum that you were used to up until now, with. So don't forget, with could be the meaning of cum, and it might not be a cum clause at all. So you have to find a subjunctive somewhere for it to be a cum clause. So if it's a cum clause, then it has to introduce a whole clause, which is a whole sentence. If it's just a little phrase, like with the keys, then that's not a cum clause. All right, so lastly, when cum tremerem. Now this time the cum is at the front, so it's going to be whereas. Cum tremorem me frigidum sentiebam. Whereas at that time I was shivering, myself cold I was feeling. I felt myself cold. And there's your answers. Okay, so the first one, nil temere debebamos, cum ferox leo cateni swinctus esset. I look at cum, I notice it's in the middle of the sentence, and I also notice that it introduces a whole clause, so it's going to be a cum clause because it's starting a whole clause, not just one ablative word. I introduce that it's introducing a whole clause, so it's going to be a cum clause, and so since it's in the middle of the sentence, it's a given that. Next one, nuper fabrum cum urbis clavibus heri vidi, quamquam lex tale non desinit. Now look at this, the comma is here, the cum is not at the start of a clause, because you would expect it to be where the nuper is or where the quamquam is, introducing that whole clause, but it's right in the middle. What's that? Well, in this case, it's actually cum clavibus is just the phrase, with the keys of the city. So this is not a cum clause at all. This is just your old meaning of cum as with. So watch out for this. Cum might not always be introducing a whole clause. It might just be introducing a tiny little phrase inside of a clause. And that's not a cum clause. That's a standard ablative of means or accompaniment or something like that. So just watch out for that. Lastly, cum tremorem me frigidum sentiebam. Okay, so here we have cum at the start of a whole clause, and it's at the start of the sentence, so this one's going to be whereas. And you see those are the answers. Brilliant. Okay. So now you know pretty well how to recognize which of the literal senses of cum are correct. Now let's dig in and figure out which of the figurative or contextual senses of cum are correct. We have 5 of them up here, as we said, and this is how you figure out which one is appropriate to the given situation. So when you have a main verb, you could have a backward-looking subjunctive action feeding into it, or it could be talking about a forward-looking subjunctive action jutting off into the future. Well, if it's talking about the past, then you can have after, because after we would have blanked, we blanked, is how that would go. If it's talking about the present or future, then you could use while. We blank while something may happen, is how that would go. When can work for either of them. So when is the safest of all 5 of these figurative contextual meanings, because when can cover any time whatsoever. All right, so both of those can become whens. But when you translate it as when, while, or after, if the meaning sounds kind of lame and like, so what? Like some actor out on the stage doing something completely divorced from surrounding circumstances, like, when I won the race, I was happy. Huh? And you really want a more meaty explanation? Probably it's one of the other 2 meanings that is the best one, since or although. So instead of when, while, and after, you might want to try since. And you notice here, since is a substitute for after, not a substitute for while, covering an event before the main verb. Since we might have blanked, therefore main verb we blanked. Although is the same way. Although something might have happened, this happened. So instead of after, you might want to try since or although. So those are our 5 meanings, when, while, since, and although. When is always appropriate. After and while, one or the other will be appropriate depending whether it's a forward-looking subjunctive or a backward-looking subjunctive. And then lastly, since and although might be appropriate, and only if it's a backward-looking subjunctive. Almost always. Rarely a forward-looking subjunctive, but is rare. So decide which one or ones, because multiple ones could work, of the 5 contextual meanings could be appropriate. When, while, after, since, or although. Nihil temere debebamos cum ferax leo cateni swinctus esse. Mr. Rudman, I don't know what that means. Oh, well, push the clue and it will tell you. We owed it not to have been fearing, given that the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. All right, well, when is always appropriate. So you know A is going to be all the answer for all of these, right? While was when we have forward-looking subjunctives. Let's look. Do we have a forward-looking subjunctive? Esset, is that a forward-looking subjunctive? It could be, but winctus esset is a backward-looking subjunctive. That's the passive of winxerit. So actually this one could go either way, because you could treat the verb as just esset, with winctus being an adjective, unimportant adjective, or you could treat the verb as being the whole thing, winctus esset, in which case it's backward-looking. So, you know, really any of these could work, while or after. We owed it not to have been fearing. We owed it not to have been fearing after the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. Yeah, that works. We owed it not to have been fearing while the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. Nah, that doesn't work. Because you don't say while referring to an event even farther back in the past. So that one doesn't work. After works, and now let's try when. We owed it not to have been fearing when the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. Yeah, that works, but it's lame, isn't it? So let's try one of the two alternate, causal or concessive. We owed it not to have been fearing since the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. That satisfies me. Now, if the since works, the although almost certainly won't. But let's try it anyways. We owed it not to have been fearing although the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. What's your problem? You mean that you should have been afraid because he was tied up? So that makes no logical sense at all. So our answers, therefore, are going to be A, C, and D. Stop the video, try the rest of these, and then start it again when you're ready to see the answers. All right, so there are your meanings of CUM. We'll put those up there. And now let's go into the understanding of the subjunctive verb inside the CUM clause. Any of these will work. Any tense of the subjunctive, any SH, W, C, or M form of the verb. I encourage you to use these all the time in your subjunctive clause. In a second, we're going to find how most people do CUM clauses today, and that is that they translate it as if it were an indicative, without these SH, W, C, or M helper words. And to me, that destroys the subjunctive sense or connotation of the CUM clause. So I encourage you to just translate it literally according to your standard SHWCM rules, not to use what they do. But you'll see what they do in a second. All right, so now you should know how other people translate CUM clauses, because they may tell you this stuff. And maybe it might be helpful to you at some point, but I don't think it's going to. Now, the old way is that they still use shall and will, can, may forms, but should, would, could, might forms, they don't. Instead, they translate these as an indicative. So the way they translate these are like a normal indicative. When he was blanking, they say, or when he had blanked. And they call it the pluperfect subjunctive for that reason. Because that the pluperfect subjunctive on the timeline frequently is at the same time as the past backward-looking subjunctive, therefore they call this the pluperfect subjunctive. Because translating it this way is safe. Had is always farthest back in time, so if you translate it as had, then yeah, it'll work. But you're starting to build a system here that is not going to work out in the end. The main problem with this is that pluperfect designates a definitive time on the timeline, had blanked, back then, whereas subjunctives are supposed by nature to be variable and able to move on the timeline hazily relative to where their main verb is. So subjunctives are supposed to designate general circumstances, not an exact time. And so by calling it pluperfect subjunctive, they're implying that it has an exact time when really it doesn't, and it's going to mess them up when they get into these later tenses up here. So for this one, they logically call it the imperfect subjunctive because it frequently works. Not always, because sometimes they are forced into would, so they're already having problems there. And then they want to continue their system and they say, oh, well, what's the shall of, will of, can of, may of? We had two past versions here. Let's call that the perfect subjunctive. which I've already said that makes no sense because this thing is relative to the future tense. If shall have blanked, then will blank. So it's often talking about things in the future, whereas they call it the perfect subjunctive as if it's sometime back in the past, which is completely wrong. But you don't even have to worry about that because it's so rare that you'll hardly ever see it in Latin. And then for this last one, they call it the present subjunctive. And I don't really have a problem with that because that's basically what I call it. I call it the present plus because it also can include an action occurring in the future, shall, will, but they don't mention that. So their names are giving you the misimpression that these subjunctives occur at set places on the timeline when they don't. So I don't recommend that you say cum when blank was happening, or had happened, or when blank happens, just like a normal indicative. Say it the way it should be, the way it's written. When something may happen, when something should happen, when something should have happened. And that will remind you that this is just a general hypothetical imaginary circumstance, not an actual event, which they then must do more acrobatics later to accommodate for in their translations. And they'll dream up little phrases like less vivid and contrary to fact. Well, you'll already know it's less vivid and contrary to fact if you're translating it like should and shall. So obviously this is a better system, I think. All right, so how do you make the subjunctive verbs? Well, remember, you can start with either kind of stem, regardless of where the main verb is. And let's go through a couple of these. Id non difficula est is a present main verb. Cum tantum equitatu valeamus, when we should be so strong in cavalry. All right. Well, this is obviously going to be in the green sphere because it's got a green present stem. So that's the present forward-looking subjunctive. And here's how you're going to translate it. Just take it in order. It is not difficult, considering that at this time, we may avail or be strong so much in cavalry. And remember that instead of given considering that, you could use one of these 5. In this case, the ones that will work are since, when, and while. It isn't difficult since we may avail so strong in cavalry. Cum primi ordines cecidissent, it's going to be one of those two. Tamen acerrime reliqui resistebant. Well, bant is past, so it's going to be the left one. All right, put it in place. Whereas at that time, the first rows should have fallen. Alternately, you could use their way of translating it like an indicative, were having fallen or had fallen. Tamen, however, the rest were resisting bitterly. In this case, the ones that will work are although, when, and after. And the big giveaway is, look here, tamen. However. Obviously, if you've got a however, you're going to start with an although. And that's going to be your best translation for a fancy production. Atticus didn't seek honors, past tense. So there's where your main verb is. Cum ei paterent. And obviously, this is forward-looking. Atticus didn't seek honors, given that, considering that at this time, they should lie open to him. And alternately, you could say although, or when or while, since it's a forward-looking one. And the way they would translate it is Atticus didn't seek honors since they were lying open to him, just as if it were a regular imperfect. But, you know, that seems pretty darn vivid. And I would rather you keep it subjunctive with should lie open, because that more conveys the actual sense of how a subjunctive is meant to be taken. Galli cum se defendere non possent. Now, you might think to yourself the cum is in the middle of the sentence. This is not a cum clause, but really it is, because it really is at the start of the sentence. Because really you can just flip the galli and cum, rearrange it to cum galli se defendere non possent. So watch out for something like this. But you know it's not just an ablative of means or accompaniment, because there's no ablative right after the cum. Nuntios ad Caesarem miserunt. The Gauls, given that, considering that at that time they should not be able to defend themselves, or couldn't defend themselves, or were not being able to defend themselves, sent messengers to Caesar. And for cum, you could alternately say since. Since the Gauls could not defend themselves, they sent messengers to Caesar. Or since it's forward-looking, while will work. All right, so change the underlined clause into a cum clause having a subjunctive verb. The bold adverb will disappear as its meaning gets absorbed by the cum. All right, so although is going to disappear. You're going to replace although with cum of some sort, and then you want to turn this whole underlined thing into a cum clause by making the verb subjunctive. Now, when you do this, you're going to think to yourself, well, which of the 4 tenses of subjunctive should I use? And look up here in the box for that. Remember, the subjunctive verb's action has to be before the main verb's action for you to use that backward-looking subjunctive. Anywhere else, if it's like at the same time as the main verb or later than the main verb, you're going to use a forward-looking subjunctive. So pay attention to what the relationship is between the main verb and the subjunctive verb. So although we were happy, they were angry. The main verb is were, and the subjunctive verb is were. Same time, this means that you're going to be using the forward-looking one, because you have to have earlier to use the backward-looking one. And if you're having trouble translating, you can use the clue and read it like this. Ei fuerent irati, whereas we might be happy. That'll work too. And the might be here is a dead giveaway. But hopefully you don't need to use these clues. It's better for you to get the practice of deciding where is the main verb on the timeline, and then is my subjunctive going to be forward or backward looking relative to that. All right, so stop the video and try these, and try the ones on the next slide as well, which are mainly passives, much more difficult, and then start it again when you're ready to keep going. Our last and final subjunctive construction is going to be called a conditional sentence. A conditional sentence has 2 clauses. One is called the conditional clause, also called the protasis, or in logic class, they might call it the hypothesis or the if statement. And the rest is going to be the main clause, which is also called the apodosis, or in logic class, the conclusion or the then statement. And the if and the then are going to be riveted to their clause. They never separate from their clause. So sometimes they may flip places, but the if and then will flip places also, just like this. If you cook, then I will eat can flip places to I will eat if you cook. See how that happened? And notice this one on the right is still the protasis, and that one on the left is still the apodosis. So you can encounter conditional sentences in either format. All right, what about the verb itself? Well, there are 3 possible patterns it can have. It can be if indicative, then indicative, which you can translate already since it doesn't even involve a subjunctive. However, you might have the if statement be a subjunctive, or you might have both the if and then statements be a subjunctive. And each one of these is going to be translated in a different way. The first one is just like normal. You've been doing it all along. The second one is also like normal, where you're just going to use your SH, WC, or M words for the subjunctive. And then you'll just translate the indicative like a normal indicative. So, you can expect that. But this last one here is weird. And it's almost always going to be the SH form, then the W form. If should, then would. Or if shall, then will. All right, so a general warning. Avoid other textbooks and grammar's instructions on how to translate conditional sentences. They are wrong and confusing. And they will label different kinds of conditional sentences as, oh, well, this is a contrary to fact conditional sentence. And this is a future less vivid conditional sentence. And you'll be reading this and think to yourself, oh boy, I need to memorize these terms, and then I need to memorize which ones are futureless vivid and which ones are contrary to fact present, and you'll have a conniption trying to figure this out. And it's all unnecessary. You don't need it at all. And it's wrong, because when they try to do this, they'll present translations that are objectively wrong, losing the sense of the subjunctive verbs. So forget all this stuff, and instead just follow your standard SHWCM rules for subjunctives and indicative rules for indicatives. It's so easy. Now, it's not going to always be perfect, because sometimes the sense will be a little bit un-Englishy, but you can figure it out. You might have to try a different SHWC or M one to make it really work and sound good, or you could just imagine your timeline and think of it in Latin, not trying to translate it, and that would be the best way to go. All right, so guidelines for interpreting. If you have two subjunctive clauses, then favor an SHW pattern. If shall, then will. If shall have, then will have. If should, then would. If should have, then would have. You can also occasionally have like the VE and then no VE, like if should have, then would. That'll work too. Okay, a second guideline. If the verb is subjunctive, then imagine it in theory, in principle, less vividly than you would a real event. And lastly, there's this special rule that you may have heard before. After si, nisi, num, and ne, all the alleys fall away. So if you run into something like this in a sentence, and you're trying to translate it, and it's something like if what said, or if said what, and it doesn't make sense, remember this rule. After si, nisi, num, and ne, all the alleys fall away. So there's probably a hidden alley in there. And so really now, suddenly it makes sense. Aliquid means anything. So if anything he said, oh, bingo, we've got it. So remember these three rules. Should, would, when you have two subjunctives, vagueness, and alleys slipping in after the conjunction. So here's some examples of other textbooks messing it up, but we'll also get some experience going through these. If he were present, it would be well, they say. No, don't translate it like an indicative, it's a subjunctive. If he should be present, it would be well. And here you've satisfied your SHW rule, because it had two subjunctives. If hoc dicas creditur, they'll say, if anyone ever says this, it is always believed. Well, why do you need to slip in ever and always? If you just said it like a should be, it would work. If anyone may say this, he is believed. See how this is conveying a principle in theory? Okay, now, then you don't need ever and always. See, Marcus Julium amet, ea elm amet. Two subjunctives, probably a SHW rule, but they'll say, if Marcus should someday love Julia, she would love him. I'm sorry, just keep it, if Marcus shall love Julia, she will love him. Both present looking forward subjunctives. The same book says, if Marcus amaret Julia, she amaret eam. And they'll translate this as, if Marcus loved Julia. They claim this is an imperfect subjunctive, but they don't even do it like a was blanking. But this is obviously not as good as, if Marcus should love Julia, she would love him. Now, notice this. They translated both of these as should love him, even though one was a present forward-looking and the other was a past forward-looking. So obviously they lost meaning using the common way of translating subjunctives. Don't do that. Do our way, the way of translating with SHWCM, and avoid the mess. All right, so frequently used sequences. So these are sequences of if-thens that you'll often run into. Okay, so this one is on the timeline, so imagine that these are indicatives. If will, then will. So too, this is also indicatives. If will of, then will. That's called the future perfect, which you'll learn in stage 30. It's a subset of the greater present backward-looking subjunctive. But, okay, now this is not on the timeline, so this is subjunctives. If shall, will is very common. If should, would is very common. If blanked, then something blanked. This pattern of two indicatives is common. If should've, would've, that's very common. Lastly, if should've, then would, that's common. All right, so you see here that conditional clauses can really be pretty much anywhere. The key is not to remember where they occur in the timeline. The key is just to read them in order on the page as what they literally say. So let's see how well you remembered those rules that I gave to you. So try these questions here. On this slide, you're attempting to identify errors in subjunctives. So like in this one, there is a problem with it. It's written wrongly. And I want you to tell me what's wrong with it. If you need the English, there it is for you. But it should be written differently. And go through this slide. And then after you're done with it, then try the next two slides as well, in which you are going to actually write subjunctives. And then start the video again when you're ready to go on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to get into actually writing subjunctives. And if you forget a word, they're all right here on this slide, so feel free to always come back to this if you forget a word. Okay, so write these conditional statements in Latin. If you may have an illness, don't kiss me. As you do this, pay attention to what tense every verb is and write it as that tense. So may have is going to be present, future-looking, forward-looking subjunctive. Don't kiss me is a command form, so write it as a command form. If you will have caught sight of Rome, you will indeed be silent. Will have is present backward-looking, or if you're in stage 30, that's also the future perfect. And will is future, so write it like that. And you can try the rest of these. Stop the video and then start it again when you're ready to see the answers. Okay, so hopefully you can make out the different choices here, like oscularis or osculamini, or tum or tunc, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's it. We have gone through 7 different kinds of subjunctive clauses, and that is going to be 99% of every subjunctive that you'll ever see in any work in Latin. So good luck and enjoy it, and start reading these subjunctive clauses like an expert. Walete.